In this presentation about my practice research, the first 5 minutes will be a performance installation. What you hear from this radio is an extract of a real-life audio story recorded of a friend of mine, Alicia, pictured at the top there. Accompanying her speech is a recording of her leading an impromptu flamenco class, her dance practice being her passion. I will then follow this with a spoken word poem about a particular childhood memory of my own. Underneath my poem there will be a recording of a 1970s television commentary on a famous UK horse race. It's the annual Grand National event at Aintree. There are reasons for this audio reference and why I'll be reading this poem in the presentation from this 1981 copy of the tabloid newspaper The Sun. These are all vivid associations I have of my grandfather Cara Neal, who you can see in the framed picture there, sat at his chair by the window in the living room where I grew up in rural Staffordshire during the 1970s and 80s. The piece you're about to watch is what I call an Nantervention, and it is taken from a 2-year project, Nankids, and it toured Spill, Deptford X and Wandsworth Arts Fringe Festivals. The chair I'm sat on used to belong to my grandmother, Sheila, and I am a white, cisgendered, male-identifying, non-binary person, aged 51, wearing a Tamala Motown t-shirt, and that's a reference to my mother, Sandra, in her musical tastes. This audio story and spoken word poem will then be followed by a 9-minute presentation. This paper first gives an overview of the hidden world of kinship care, then it provides social and cultural context on the two memories you are about to hear, both of these being incidences that have acute resonances for Alicia and myself. This presentation concludes by briefly touching on how the academic writings of Sara Ahmed and Kareem Kubchandani may offer insights to Alicia's and our own individuation's senses of self-worth and our families of origins. If you're sitting comfortably, I will begin.
I didn't get it quite. I don't think it was hidden from me, but I don't think I actually knew, and I don't think anybody had formally told me until one day, maybe at the age of 5 or 6, my cousin, came into the living room. I can almost remember it quite clearly, and I was calling my grandmother Mum, and he was like, "You know she's not your mum." And it wasn't a complete shock to me that she wasn't, but nobody'd ever said it like that. After that, I think I went to her and said, he said, "You're not my mum," and she sat me down. But I sort of had the feeling that she'd sat me down before and that we'd looked through the pictures of my mum, and she was like, this is your mum, these are your sisters, trying to explain something to me about how I came to be.
On the king himself, the horse who could become the first £100,000 steeplechaser today, Red Rum. There he is, the horse who's run 74 times under national hunt rules and has never fallen, and today could become the first ever triple winner of the Grand National.
The starter preparing to mount his rostrum, in fact, going up now. And the white flag up there under starter's orders. Kilmore Boy being led up. And they've gone. Spit an image just a little bit slow. Southern Crest a little bit slow. And as they race down towards the Melling Road...
Riding round on the front lawn on my bike. I might have been 4, I might have been 5. The catnip in hedges, there are 2 cars on the drive. Sounds of many bird songs, sweet summer, sickly scent. Round and round in a circle, on front lawn on my bike. They're all inside. Mum and Dad, my sister Sandra, her husband Chuck, and their son Mark. The telly is on. Saturday afternoon. Horse racing. They don't switch it off, even though there's visitors. So many circles now I've done. Working it out. Family tree. On the front lawn, on my bike. It's not that the penny drops, more that the jigsaw of what I've been told, all now, all fits. I had always been told that it was Sandra who had given birth to me, but Sandra had only been 14. So Mum was really my grandmother, and Dad my grandfather. They'd had to take over. Mum's making tea. Sandra says behind her back it's always too weak. All the time, Sandra picks faults.
And they touch down together. Red Rum and Lescargo. On the right of the picture, it's Lescargo, Tommy Carberry. On the left, it's Red Rum trying to make national history with Brian Fletcher, and he's the first under pressure, Red Rum, as they come to the final fence in the national. In third place is Spanish Steps.
People like me are nan kids, as comedian Russell Brand called us, himself raised at points by both his grandmothers. We are brought up in kinship care arrangements, a term mostly used by social workers and teachers. We were children who, for whatever reason, had to be raised by grandparents or other relatives and family friends. 10 years ago, thanks to Winston Churchill Fellowship Bursary, I travelled 8 states across North America over 6 weeks. The purpose of this trip was to meet families like mine, where relatives other than the birth parents had to step into parent children. As Michelle Chappell of Grandparent Family Apartments in the Bronx told me, the reason for a grandparent having to take on a parenting role is never a good one. The birth parents might have died, be away working overseas, or they may be unable to parent as they are struggling with addictions or mental health. Consistently, a child in kinship care has always experienced a profound sense of loss. In the UK, at any given time, 200,000 children and young people are living in kinship care arrangements. As research evidences, the resulting educational and health outcomes are better for the child brought up by kin. Also, the financial cost is far less than fostering, adoption or care provision, so whenever possible, children staying within their families is the preferred route of local authorities. Often, though, these arrangements don't reach the attention of social services, and the families can be frightened that the children may be taken away. Alicia, whose story you heard the extract of first, is a British Caribbean North London woman in her late 40s. Her working class community experience of that time, the 1970s, was that the parents often had to work away. The care of children like her was an assumed collective responsibility of kin, these being a wide circle of aunties and uncles who were friends as well as blood relatives, everyone looking out for each other's families. As such, Alicia told me there was an openness about these kinship care arrangements. Everyone in the community knew that Grandma was bringing Alicia up. Similarly, the attitude was borne out by many of the African American and Latino families I met in the States in 2012. In celebrating the dancing aunties who helped define their queer identity during childhood, Kubchandani asserts that origin stories matter. Like Kubchandani, I share their queerness, and we both protected this like a shameful secret in our first flushes of burgeoning sexuality. But because of the intersecting kinship care upbringing I experienced, my hidden history goes back further, pre my birth and to my conception. I knew I was born to a 14-year-old mother, and so I had to be adopted by my grandparents. What you heard in my poem is the moment I conceptually grasped the complexity of this arrangement. But until I was 42 years old, and my birth mother was dying, I was not told who my father was, as my grandmother was determined I should never know. My grandmother, who took on the responsibility of my parenting, concealed the information about my father. Consequently, I grew up in an environment of secrecy, and this fostered an implicit understanding that something was not quite right. As Sarah Ahmed writes on the characteristics of shame, this double play of concealment and exposure is crucial to the work of shame. The word shame comes from the Indo-European verb for to cover, which associates shame with other words such as hide, custody, hut and house, which is referencing Schneider in 1987 there. Shame certainly involves an impulse to take cover and to cover oneself. I would argue that it was not just my circumstance, but in the cases of many white people raised in kinship care that I've spoken to since 2012, there can be a profound sense of shame in our families. I might suggest that this engenders a sense of collective failure when kinship care arrangements have to be put into place, usually happening at the point of a domestic crisis. Indeed, the charity Kinships 2017 research by Wellard, Meekings, Farmer and Hunt identified a need for a greater awareness of the situation of young people in kinship care. So, unlike Kubchandani, my performance actions in Nankids are not celebrations or objects I identify with. They are working class hobbies and crafts, so as well as the horse racing and reading tabloids referenced today, these actions have included flower arranging, painting with watercolours and darning socks, practices I associate with my grandmother. The intention of doing this is to outwardly project towards the receiving audience a cognitive dissonance that belies the darker realities of the stories underneath. I didn't look up in admiration to my grandmother in the way that Kubchandani saw queer dance identification via his aunties. I felt and inherited a sense of shame and the anxiety around concerns and the thoughts of others. I saw a woman trying her best in very difficult circumstances, but one that was actively practising avoidance and determined to do her best to keep up appearances in front of other villagers. Does my lived experience suggest a disruption of communal care and connection in Western neoliberal society? When the nuclear family is the capitalist ideal, do those who fail to conform experience shame and judgment? During my next 2 years of research, I will be investigating perspectives from critical whiteness studies to explore the complexities of my family's white working class identity. By presenting these domestic tableaux in pub, beer garden, the grounds of a church garden and graveyard, libraries, cafes and an art gallery, Nankids took these stories to arts attenders. Consistently, after each performance, at least one audience member would tell me how they knew someone raised by an auntie or a grandmother. One cafe owner told me, I found the topic very interesting. I didn't realise it was a thing, but looking back to my childhood, I remember a young girl who lived in my street that became pregnant underage and her parents raised the child as her own. Perhaps most gratifying for me was the transformative aspect for the Nankids co-creators who shared their stories and gave me permission to create audio sound word portraits from their hidden stories. In doing this project, I discovered I wasn't alone in being told by others growing up that at least you weren't put into care. This is true, but a child doesn't choose their parents, and we shouldn't be made to feel indebted that someone cared for us, as I would propose this may lead to poor mental health later in life. So when Nankid Iwan wrote to say, thank you, on reflection it was really cathartic, bless you for coming into my life, I'm glad to know that for certain my artwork made a positive difference to at least one person. My concept of a Nantervention that then is an upturning, a flipping on its head, a queering of social norms. Our stories, as the children raised by grandparents, are rarely told. My arts praxis here is an attempt, like Ahmed's wider mission when she originally wrote The Cultural Politics of Emotion in 2004, to lift the lid on hidden histories that uncover how we become invested in social norms. An Nantervention, then, is a working class twist on the artistic intervention, a praxis popular with Dadaist artists a century ago. Nonsensical and absurd actions by artists aiming to disrupt the normative. My Nan, though, what she was aiming for was sadly quite the reverse. By engaging in cute hobbies and crafts, my Nan hoped and wished to keep reality at bay. She craved an acceptance of heteronormativity, wanted to divert from her perceptions of shame and social failure by practising a lifelong Nantervention herself. By a nothing to see here approach, she tried but failed to avoid a family trauma. Like most of us, though, Sheila did her best, my grandmother, in difficult circumstances, but secrets keep us sick and shame only dies on exposure. Thank you for watching my presentation, and these are my references.